Everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know we're a little bit late on time, and we will have this session go until 11:20 to make sure that everyone still has time for lunch, which means we don't have a lot of time. So I want to go ahead and get started because we have such a great, well, to me, a topic that I'm very passionate about, and such a great panel of speakers. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Director of Global Food Security here at CSIS. And just to start off with, as the #1 defense tank in the world, we take security very seriously. So not that we expect any issues, but if there are any issues, I am your security officer. So today meaning Global Development Forum, we're looking at development trends. And anyone who's been watching development and global food security issues in the last few years knows it's been quite a fascinating ride. From the food price spikes that happened in 2007 and 2008, there were documented at least 30 different riots around the world and other civil unrest related to that. And that really sparked renewed interest by the US government as well as the international community to understand better the linkages between food insecurity and political instability. And after decades of decline, the US government and others started to reinvest back into agricultural development. The Obama administration alone has invested over $5.6 billion just in its presidential initiative called Feed the Future. That doesn't include other elements of food security that people think of when they think of food aid or other humanitarian assistance. And when you think about where we are right now in development related to the Sustainable Development Goals, some people could argue that 15 of the 17 development goals could be related back to food security in some way. And I want to talk a little, before we really dive in, of what we mean in this panel on global food security. We're not talking about food aid or food aid reform or farm bill or really even humanitarian assistance. What we're zeroed in on today is talking about long-term agricultural development. And so that's a variety of aspects, from working with smallholder farmers around the world to teach them better practices, raise their income, catalyze markets. It's also about nutrition, particularly in the first 1,000 days. So it's a host of things, but what's different about specifically Feed the Future and the US government's focus now compared to before is really zeroing in on the root causes of hunger and poverty. And I think a lot of times people don't quite know the power of agriculture. A lot of you in this room do, because you've been working on it for a long time. But what's really special about agriculture is its economic leverage. When you look at agriculture, it's the primary source of employment for 70% of the world's poor, and it contributes to 1/3 of the GDP in many of the least developing countries. And we know that GDP growth in ag can be 4 times as effective as growth in raising income, as growth in other sectors as far as raising incomes. So agricultural development has some serious economic power behind it. We also know that it has some serious national security power, or I think because of the food price crisis and the civil unrest we saw in those days is why the US government as well as others are reinvesting in this sector. It's also important to remember that agriculture is a business. When I think about smallholder farmers, that woman, that man, to me, they're already a businesswoman or businessman, but they're also an entrepreneur, because it's all about raising their income, it's linking to markets. And we're not going to talk about today specifically of is the private sector important and private sector partnerships. Everyone here, well, we know that, and most of you do too, and why that's an interesting conversation to have, particularly to think of how the US government has been engaging the private sector in different ways and how that relates to technology or how that relates to different models of partnerships that are successful or not. That's not really what our focus is on today. What we're going to be talking about is more about the power of policy, about the laws and regulations on the country level and how that can both inhibit and entice private sector engagement. You know, anyone, again, who's been engaged in this knows that agriculture is incredibly complex. There's a lot of different layers that have to come together in order for there to be an agricultural transformation. So that's everything from better seeds, better market linkages, better information, technology, we could go on and on. But another element of that is around policy. And I found that I think the policy environment, that enabling environment, those words, it's often not very well understood. It's kind of difficult to measure success, and it can be really challenging to enforce. You can have one thing on paper, but then actually implementing it is quite challenging. And the private sector can't really be a true partner in agriculture unless there's the right kind of enabling environment there for them. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this dialogue today. We have such a great panel, from implementing partners to U.S. government leadership to country-level leadership to representatives of the private sector. So I really want to turn to them. And I'd like to turn things on its head a little bit. So instead of ladies first, we will start with men first. So those pictures of, all male panels. Take a picture of this. Nate is my token male. No, Nate is actually the reason I blame him often for my love of policy, because working with him before I took this job and the work that he's done at FinTrack around enabling environments is part of why I've better understood the importance of policy. So Nate, to start with, what are we talking about? What is an enabling environment, and why is it so important?
Well, thanks, Kimberly. I may be biased, but I think this is a really critical topic. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on it. So within food systems, the way that we tend to define the enabling environment is that it's the set of formal and informal rules and institutions that shape the incentives that impact behavior of agricultural market participants. Smallholder farmers, input providers, food processors, distributors, even consumers. And intuitively, this makes sense. It makes sense that the rules of the game would impact not only decisions and behaviors and if you will, how you play the game, but also the outcomes and the extent to which agricultural markets and interventions really are geared towards achieving lasting impact. Things like timely and valid market information, legal and institutional public goods like enforceable contracts, secure property rights, relatively free and open trading systems, competition policy enforcement. Each of these things, when properly enforced, can have some really impactful outcomes. They can open up finance. They can facilitate market linkages that can improve cross-border trade, and decrease consumer prices. Conversely, a poor enabling environment can create a double negative impact on food security, raising the costs for consumers while also cutting into the razor-thin margins that smallholder producers, larger scale producers, processors actually take home. So, firms throughout the agricultural market system are directly impacted by what the rules say and how they're enforced. And it's funny, Kimberly, you talked about the difference between the laws that are on the books and the laws that are implemented. A mentor of mine who is also an employee of USAID talks about how there are really 4 sets of laws for every law that's on the books. There's the law they meant to write, there's the law they wrote, there's the law they enforce, and then there's the law that everybody actually believes in their day-to-day transactions and actually incorporates. And figuring out how you navigate that complex system is an extraordinary challenge, both for policymakers and for donor agencies and for, with humility, consultants that try to offer comparable evidence to help inform the dialogue. So it's not an easy topic, and it is challenging to try to capture and define impact, but I think it's a challenge that is really quite critical, and it's exciting to see that there is a lot of headway now and a lot of momentum in trying to undertake some reforms. So I thought I would just go over just a couple of examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about enabling environment and some sub-themes that I think will really give it some concrete definition. So one of the sub-themes that I bring up is that burdensome regulatory processes can restrict private sector investment. Now, I mean, in some respects that does seem intuitive, but it's nice to have a little bit of evidence and data to reinforce that relative truism. So smart regulations implemented by qualified and capable governmental staff can clear the path for greater private sector engagement. Overly restrictive or burdensome regulatory processes can affect time to market for example, new seed varieties, which can limit return on investment, delay benefit to farmers for accessing new varieties, and ultimately discourage private sector involvement. In 2013-2014, our project had the opportunity to conduct some research into seed registration processes in Bangladesh and Nepal. And some of the findings that we thought were really quite interesting. So the seed registration process in Bangladesh is considerably faster and less expensive than in Nepal. It's 30% faster and 68% less expensive to register a new seed variety in Bangladesh than Nepal. And you tend to see a correlation between that and the quantity of private sector new seed varieties introduced on the market. 3 times the number of seed varieties are introduced by private sector players annually in Bangladesh than Nepal. So you begin to see not necessarily a causal link, but at least a correlation over time. When you look at time series data, you do begin to see a correlation between the relative burden of regulation and the return on investment and the ultimate impact on the seed sector. Another point I wanted to bring up. Property and contract systems have a statistically significant impact on lending. So when we talk about agricultural finance, and you always tend to hear that, agricultural finance is oftentimes prohibitively expensive, cost of capital is too high, terms are maturity terms are too low, they don't last the full harvest cycle. Well, as it turns out, there's been some, I think, relatively groundbreaking research that's been done that look at some of the factors that drive the cost of capital and commercial lending terms. And increasingly, things like creditors' rights under bankruptcy provisions, the strength of contracts enforcement, and the strength of property rights have a clear positive impact on lending terms and have a large order of magnitude impact. So beginning to kind of understand, well, how these somewhat abstract concepts really tie into some of these key inputs that are quite critical to the agricultural sector development, I think really starts to give some meat to this topic. Final subpoint I wanted to mention was that regulatory systems can have unintended direct consequences on access to food. A lot of times in our work under previous programs, we've focused primarily on the impact on production and maybe on market linkages, but we haven't perhaps always focused as much on the access question. And there was a really interesting case study that came out in Mexico, in Chiapas State, where where an enabling environment had real direct consequences on retail food prices, urban retail food prices. So in Mexico, in Chiapas State, there was a municipal licensing scheme for tortilla sellers that essentially had the impact that it created certain jurisdictions for where you could sell your tortillas, and it had an impact that it essentially created mini monopolies on tortilla retailers. And this scheme ended up having a 40% spike in the price of tortillas, which, if you're living in Chiapas State, it's a staple crop. And the cost of this is particularly borne on the least food secure, poorest segments of society. So, I mean, I guess the sum total point that I'm trying to make is that, as we approach these topics, we talk about contracts, talk about property, competition policy, there are very real consequences to some of these abstract topics. And so, I think I'm going to perhaps leave it at that, just provide a little bit of this evidence. And there are a lot of topics you really can't cover in a short period of time, things like gender inclusivity, regional market integration. There's so much that I hope we can discuss, but looking at the time, I'll just yield at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. I particularly like the access to food point because, as we think about how we're going to increase production to feed a global demand, a growing population with limited resources, it's not always about food availability. It's really about access and distribution, and it's interesting how a nuanced thing like this that's so not understood can have such real consequences, like you said. Let's turn to Pat. Pat's the director of agribusiness at the Corporate Counsel in Africa, so she works a lot with speaking for the private sector voice. And even in your previous life with USDA, your understanding of trade and how it's all interconnected, tell us about how country-level laws and regulations, like what Nate was talking about, how does that affect the private sector, and what role does the private sector play in agriculture transformation? Why is it so critical that they be engaged?
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. I want to thank you and Caitlin and Dr. Siddiqui and the rest of the CSIS staff for inviting me on this very important panel. I just want to say a little bit first about the Corporate Counsel in Africa, because I want you to know that, just to get a feel for the organization, It's an organization that represents about 80% of total U.S. trade and investment in Africa, and of U.S. companies and also of African companies. About 20% of our membership are African companies. So we're not just looking at the U.S. viewpoint, we're also looking at the African private sector viewpoint. And that 20% level is growing. So I also like your point with respect to the impact that agriculture can have on GDP. I think that's quite misunderstood and not appreciated at times because it could be the fastest accelerator of growth in the country. So the private sector is really, in my viewpoint, the only sector that can ensure long-term economic sustainability. We talk about all kinds of sustainability, but it's the economic sustainability that I'm referring to. And so they're a critical part of this equation. The government in respective countries play a very important role also. But I think that if the government of countries treat agriculture as a business, and it has not always been treated as a business, then you will see policies with regard to taxes and investment policies and standards and regulations, and what we call the enabling environment, going in the right direction. But it's got to be a whole mindset that this is not a hobby, this is a business. Okay. And agriculture has to be treated as such. And then I think you'll see that women and young people that can play a role, and it may not be in the production side of it, because agriculture needs, as you said, it's a very complex field. It needs all kinds of players involved in the whole value chain. So, and when I speak of the value chain, I'm talking about the value chain starting with the production, moving into the processing, and then the distribution of that particular commodity to a consumer, whether it be a local, a regional, or an international consumer. So that's a whole lot of players along that value chain. And as you use the word, I think it's very apropos, complex. It is a complex business. It requires a lot of players. You may not think of this, but it requires academia. If there's a problem with disease and pests, it's the academic community that we're going to go to. We need technology and innovation, and in this case, Africa has an enormous opportunity to jumpstart and use technology and innovation and avoid some of the mistakes that developed countries have unfortunately had to deal with. You have the US government and other governments involved in this sector. You have the NGO community. And then you have the private sector itself. So you have a lot of players in this sphere. And you also have a lot of players with respect to different sectors. You have to have, as I said before, science. You need technology. If you're going to have a modern system, you need infrastructure. And infrastructure is key. If you can produce as many commodities as you want, but if you can't move that commodity from the farm to the processing center, then the game is over. So infrastructure and energy, you need help. You want to make sure that those workers are healthy. They're an economic asset. Again, think of what I said as treating agriculture as a business. So, you need all of these regulations that cover all of these sectors. And finally, and most important, you need regulations with respect to, and policies with respect to the community. The community is part of that environment if you're going to really look at it. And if you have community involvement and community support, then you stand a better chance of having agriculture be productive and successful. And when companies look at agriculture, they're looking at the aggregation of the smallholder farmers also, because they cannot create economies of scale without some way of aggregating these small-scale farmers. And I often, my previous days of dealing with China for 20 years, I often look back at China's agricultural transformation. And starting in the 80s, if you were to travel, it's different now, but if you were to travel throughout the North China Plain, where many of these farmers are in China, you would see huge tracts of land. You would think you were in the United States, but you were in China. But these were individual plots that were being farmed, but they were being farmed in a collective or a cooperative manner. I don't like to use that term for Africa. It has a bad connotation, but somehow you've got to aggregate these farmers to create economies of scale. And then if you take it a step further, businesses will be attracted to regional integration, because now you may have a market not only where an individual country you may have had 60 million people, now you may have a market of 340 million people. And so that is an attraction for business. And so this regional integration that the African Union is trying to create in the Continental Free Trade Agreement is very, very important, those policies that they play. And then finally, I'd like to say that if you're looking at a market-oriented system, the government has to ensure that these products don't come to the market all at the same time, depressing prices. And then you have, there's a way that you can do it. It has to be a market-driven approach to agribusiness. Let me conclude, because there are a lot more things I can say, but let me conclude by just giving you a few examples, because you may think, oh, it's just the big guys, the big companies that are playing in this field. And yes, they are, but they're also smaller companies. And I just want to give you a few examples and how the complex relationships that they have in this field. Coke, that is a big company. Okay, but you might be surprised that I'm giving you examples of our member organizations, by the way. They are involved in better management practices. They use agricultural products. They use water. They want to make sure the water quality is good. And Coke doesn't know all this stuff, so they have to partner with others. And sometimes they partner with the nonprofit organizations and folks that understand how to organize farmers. So this is very, very important. Chevron. Chevron is an oil company, but Chevron is committed to the community. And so they get involved in areas like the Niger Delta. You don't have to have a perfect economic situation. There are problems in the Niger Delta, but they're there. They were in Angola, and they still are in Angola after the war. Okay, let me turn to a smaller company, Acro Bridges. They're a member of CCA, and they have built feeder roads in the Cameroon. But the feeder roads weren't for agriculture per se, but the agricultural sector is using those feeder roads to get their products out. Okay, Vital Capital. This is a company that belongs to CCA, and they're an impact investment firm. And they are involved in agricultural production in Angola. And they take what I call a holistic approach, making sure not only that agricultural productivity is increased and the farmers are getting a decent return for their money, but also they're making sure that the community is being served with social programs, with health programs, and education programs. And finally, International Green Structures. They're another member company of our organization. They build affordable housing. They built affordable housing both in the urban sector in Kenya, and also they're looking at the rural sector. That's important. Where are people going to live? So in conclusion, I want to say that indeed the agribusiness sector has a critical role to play in long-term economic sustainability, but they need countries to have a business approach, or at least leaning in that direction, in order to come in. And they need for countries to create market-oriented policies that they can begin to work with and have some impact on economic sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I really liked, I meant to bring this up in my opening statement as well, is the emphasis on local as well as big multinational, because when we talk about private sector, we aren't just talking about the big five agribusinesses. We're talking about the local input supplier as much as the people who are engaged in exports and trade, and that's really important. I also thank you for bringing up infrastructure. You know, no matter what topic we bring up in agriculture, infrastructure and technology are two things that are critical to the discussion. Next, we're going to move to Beth. Beth is the Deputy Coordinator for Feed the Future at USAID. And what I like about Beth, besides the fact that I just like her, but she really has a holistic perspective when it comes to Feed the Future, because she's been a mission director. She just came back from Nepal most recently as the USAID mission director. She was in the Bureau for Food Security from the very earliest days, but she also has a background working with Food for Peace and from the humanitarian angle. So she's a development practitioner who really understands this. And Beth, my question, of course, is, you know, when you look at the United States, it's working with host country governments on a variety of levels. You know, to be a Feed the Future focused country, you had to meet certain requirements. And I'm curious of how does policy reform fit into the Feed the Future portfolio, and what are you doing in Feed the Future that's related to policy?
Well, thanks, Kimberly, for that nice introduction, also for this topic. I think it's a really critical one. I think when we stood up Feed the Future, we knew that donor investment alone was not going to be able to tackle the problem of global food insecurity. And even today, even more, as development budgets are increasingly constrained with competing priorities, the global needs for food are increasing. It's becoming more and more difficult, and we know that we need partners. So we know that we cannot succeed without the commitment, leadership, and work of host country governments. The amount of resources that host countries are putting into food security far outstrips anything that donors put in. We know that we need the private sector. We cannot succeed without the private sector. It's the private sector that's going to have the long-term sustainability of the markets, the value chains, and really vitalize these sectors. We also need civil society groups that really ensure the transparency, work to ensure an inclusive agenda and protect the rights of vulnerable groups. So I guess I want to go back again to the first partner that I mentioned, which was really needing the leadership of host country governments. It's this leadership that sets the frame for everything else that we do, and really is the success or failure of what we do to impact food security. They help, as Nate points out, create the enabling environments, allowing our investments to take root, and they also create the space and opportunity for civil society to flourish, to really engage in the discussion. So through Feed the Future, we really spend a lot of time working with governments to help foster and facilitate their leadership in this effort around policies, also making sure that working with governments as they increase their investments in agriculture, that they're investing in the right things and things that are inherently public goods, such as infrastructure, as you raised, such as research that's really, really important. And really promoting things like transparent spending plans so we can actually see what they're spending it on, how we can support those broader efforts. So one of the ways that we in Feed the Future really work to advance this agenda is through our support, the initiative of the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And what this does is it brings together international donors, host governments, civil society, and the private sector around country-driven plans that incorporate commitments that really the comparative advantage from each of these groups to push forward a country's agenda in food security. So these efforts support responsible private sector investment, which is ensuring the sustainable growth, sustainable and long-term inclusive economic growth. So to date, these multi-stakeholder partnerships have leveraged more than $10 billion in commitments from the private sector in Africa. To date, $2 billion of these commitments have been realized, and this has reached 8.2 million farmers, really game-changing in their lives. The 10 African governments that are part of the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition have committed to policy commitments, many of which have already been completed and many are in process, that are really changing the landscape of food security in many of these countries. And then the development community also came through with commitments and have invested $2.3 billion to support these country-led platforms, which is 85% of what was committed. So that's very significant in of itself. So these concrete commitments are very important, but I think one of the most important things that's come out of this is the increased dialogue between these diverse actors coming to the table to support a common agenda, which is something that we didn't see enough of before, and I think just getting people to say, hey, here's a common problem, how do we come together with our different capabilities to support this effort is really important. I also wanted to give a couple of examples. Senegal, for example, it's a place where private sector had been pretty much stagnant, and one very, very important reason was the fact that you couldn't really find reliable seeds, improved seeds in the country, and so it was a really, really big problem. So in 2013, as part of the New Alliance commitments, the government of Senegal passed a new law creating new standards for seed certification. And these new seed certifications were in line with the regional ECOWAS, the regional body in West Africa, in line with their seed certification. So what it did is it really just opened up Senegal to the broader West Africa market, which is quite vibrant in seeds. And then more and more private sector was able to sort of stand up in Senegal with access to a broader market or come in from other countries. And really what you saw was lowered development transaction costs, and you're seeing certified seeds appear all over the place. And so let's see, what we did is, so Feed the Future then supports this effort on policy reform. We funded seed labs within Senegal, entered into agreements to establish private seed processing centers in Senegal, and then also trained community farmers as certified seed producers themselves for new varieties such as, the famous Nureka, the new African rice, which has 3 times as great a yield as regular rice and also is drought resistant. So we saw that last year, right, so this in 2013 is when Senegal put in place these new regulations. We saw that last year that 10,000 metric tons, this private sector, driven seed system disseminated 10,000 metric tons of improved seed varieties in rice, maize, and sorghum. Rice, maize, and millet, And so this meets the needs of 180,000 smallholder farmers who now have access to seeds that improve their yields and increase their resilience to drought. So I think that this is a real impact that we see on the ground. One more example I think that I'll close with is in Guatemala. We work with smallholders on horticulture. And really, we were looking to see sort of, okay, what are the barriers to growth in this sector? And working with the government of Guatemala, we come to find out that actually the use of pesticides leaves enough pesticide residue on the horticulture, on the products, that they're actually refused entry in the United States, of course, the huge market to the north. And so what we did is we did an analysis of what we could do to change this. And the government put in place some regulations for stronger pesticide control. And then we supported this effort by working with farmers to help them practice good pesticide use and management. We worked with testing facilities and able to implement the new standards, and then importantly, worked with the national laboratory so they could become a certified tester for pesticide residue that would be accepted in the states. And so what you saw, because of these efforts, the rejection of containers full of horticulture at the US border, the rejection of Guatemalan containers went from 1,000 containers rejected in 2008 to less than 100 in 2010. So very quickly, these types of regulations supported by some technical support can make a dramatic impact. And what we saw with the farmers that we were working with is that their incomes went up by 38%. And that is the kind of impact I think we're seeking and that we can see with effective policy reform.
Thank you, Beth. I particularly like your point on the host country leadership has to set the frame, because that's a perfect transition to move to Agnes Kilabata. Agnes has been a former ag minister in Rwanda, and she now leads the AGRA Foundation, which I'm sure she could tell us a bit more about. And as you can imagine, you're really the host country voice here. So talk to us about the challenges, the successes of how this actually looks on the ground and with country leadership so that we can have an agricultural transformation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I would love to start from where you just stopped, but let me just back up a little bit and talk about what I look at as good news coming from the continent. And the good news is that there's recognition of the role of adopting policies to ensure that agriculture starts moving. There's also recognition of the need to invest to ensure that these policies lead to the outcomes that we'd like to see. The not so good news is that we are still living in a very archaic and old political architecture that is not allowing any of these movements to happen. That we also don't have capacities to be able to move that quickly enough. That we probably, to legitimize what we do, even me in my previous role as a minister, to legitimize my job, I'm not going to accept help sitting down, you know. You coming, Beth, and you coming to my office and telling me, oh, I think you need help here and there. I'm going to tell you, so who do you think you are? You know, I'm the minister here. I must know what I'm doing, you know. So there's that real lack of capacity to be able to move some of these policies and have the evidence that one needs to be able to move policies, but also then standing your ground and saying, you know what, if we are going to lead these countries, we need to be to legitimize our positions by saying we can do it, even though it actually needs very good abilities and capacities to be able to drive these processes that we don't have. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be real need for partnerships, but some other failures that I see is failure to recognize the increasing role of the private sector and provide that room so that the private sector can become a key player. It's changing in places, but it's not always the case. And then the lengthy process of policy reform, even when it gets identified, it takes like forever to be able to reform a policy. And then the inability to enforce policies when we have them changed, and to have institutions that will match those policies that were put in place. Because policies are not enough in themselves. They have to have appropriate regulatory instruments to ensure that they happen, right? So the inability to put these instruments in place becomes a very, very serious challenge, and most people know that already. So there's if I was to, the way I look at, from an agro perspective, the way I look at the continuum of things you need to do to get agriculture moving, even when you have investments, probably our weakest point, because we are always as strong as our weakest point is going to be policy. It's going to be policy. It's not technologies, it's not access to input systems, it's not whatever. It's going to be policy and how we set up mechanisms to drive policies in these countries. So, but there's been real good examples in leadership on the continent that shows that it's doable. Mm-hmm. Some countries have taken on the challenge and started working on policies that will ensure that they're driving food security and nutritional security. You're seeing this in a few countries. In 2003, between 2003 and 2007, when countries decided they would drive the CADAP agenda, about 6 countries immediately started putting more than 10% of their budgets in agriculture. For these countries, actually, they've been able to increase agriculture, the growth in agriculture faster than their populations are growing. And 3 of them have even had reductions in poverty that are related to what has happened in the agriculture sector. So there's evidence that if the right things are done, if the right policies are moved, then actually growth does happen. And by the way, in some of the poorer countries, it's 11 times, not even 4 times.
Yes,
11
Sub-Saharan
times.
Africa, absolutely.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. 11 times, the growth in agriculture is 11 times as impactful as growth in any other sector. So there's evidence of what can be done, but it's hard work. The hardest part of this work I've come to realize, is around institutional building. Mm-hmm. The policy reform is one thing, but the building of institutions and coming through a lot of institutions is just so difficult. It's so difficult, and it's not what we are culturally. We don't have that. That's not what we do. I mean, before you institutionalize certain things, there's always the tendency to find shortcuts, and we're still, in one way or another, trying to find that by. We're still in the shortcut era. We are not yet in the strengthening institutions era. One country that has worked extremely hard to build, but also has been known for reforming institutions so fast is Rwanda, for instance. I mean, there's this joke around institutions reforming faster than they are formed. An institution is formed before it takes feet, it's being reformed. Then before it takes feet, it's being reformed. And that really shows you the urgency and the need that the country is trying to put into trying to understand what is right. But also Rwanda is known for being able to learn from its mistakes and trying to strengthen the next steps going forward. So there's real success in a few countries here and there that we can learn from. But I think the next important thing then goes to what you said around private sector and building sustainability systems. The most important thing is not what we are going to do as governments. The most important thing is the kind of policies we put in place to ensure that private sector does establish itself and does become the driver of businesses, because Africa has made several false starts. And I call them false starts because every time you go back, then you actually, that means you didn't succeed. And the reason that has been the case is because private sector never really got to establish the right way. So now in AGRA, one of the things we are looking at is how do you find some of these countries, how do you work with some of these countries that are really committed to reforms, whether they are working with USAID and other institutions, but very committed to reforms, and support them through that process, whether it is improving coordination systems in the country, whether it is improving evidence and policy, and whether it is improving advocacy and generating policy generating evidence from other countries and using it as an opportunity for them to learn. How do you use this and strengthen what they are doing and where they are going? This is some of the things that we are trying to see a role that is going to strengthen the role of policy and how it plays on the continent. Then how do you ensure that private sector, there are good practices from within the continent that show how private sector can be a key player in what we are doing? How do you ensure that these lessons are being passed along? And how do you ensure that the regulatory instruments that are needed are being put in place, whether the country has the capacity or is you supporting the existence of those capacities? So there are real opportunities here, and I think there's forward movement. The most important thing is there's recognition that there's a need for policy change, there is recognition that there's a need for investment in policy change, and there's recognition that private sector and reforming to ensure that private sector becomes a key player is going to be the way to go in the future. So it's just taking longer. It's difficult in some cases, but the movement is more forward than backward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It is more difficult than you know for me not to ask my wonderful questions to them, because I have a lot I want to talk about, whether it's the Global Food Security Act or the World Bank's Enabling Business and Agriculture, because those are some of the things that we're following closely here. But in the interest of time, so that we can wrap up at 11:20, I'd like to turn to the audience and do one round of questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We have mics that will come around. I will ask that you introduce yourself and kind of where you're coming from, so that we know who you are, and to keep your questions, comments very brief, since we do have a limited time. We'll have Catherine in the front right here. Raise your hands high so I can see you all. Okay.
Good. Hi, should I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, Catherine.
Good morning, and thank you. This was a fantastic discussion, and I wish we could continue this all day, because I think there's so much more that we could talk about. I'm Catherine Kuhlman. I run a nonprofit organization called the New Markets Lab, and I manage a team of lawyers from around the world, most of them from sub-Saharan Africa, representing all of the different regions. I wanted to ask a quick question about the regional, just to follow up, and then also bring this to the international level too, because I think that when we think about policy, it is a very interconnected system, and as markets expand and global value chains become more interconnected, I think that we really do need to focus very much, and I appreciate the focus of the panel, on the country level, because I think everything starts and stops there. But as we think about what's happening at the country level, how does that interconnect with some of the regional policies and the international policies? So my question on the regional is, Beth, I appreciate very much your example of ECOWAS, and I think that going into a very concrete example like that is really, really helpful. How do we think about broader regional harmonization within Africa? Pat, I think, mentioned the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is still very much an aspiration, but how do we start to get there? We've looked at the differences between all of these different regional agreements, and there are some things that will have to be worked through. So what do you all think about that, very briefly? And then at the international level, for example, what is happening at the World Trade Organization? How does that impact the policy decisions that are being made within countries? Everything from the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is a relatively new agreement that will impact cross-border trade and hopefully improve the time that it takes, to things like sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So thank you again very much.
Thank you so much. We'll go right here, the man in the green shirt.
Hi, thanks. Your question was a good segue to mine. I'm Gary Merritt, ex-USAID. When I left West Africa in, it was 1999, after some 20 years there, we had been participating with a few governments in West Africa, part of the CFA zone, with the French, and with ECOWAS people on a regional plan for West Africa. and it was labeled 2020. And it was sketching some very ambitious infrastructure prerequisites that we felt we had identified. And the question I have for you is, policies, yes, absolutely, but infrastructure, namely highways and rail, were identified at the time as key constraints for regional market promotions, if you will. And the same thing was true in East Africa from an earlier period. So many of these issues, identifying policy reform prerequisites and private sector, yay, that was actually already there for the most part in the late 90s in the thinking, forward thinking. What's happening with regional infrastructure investment with respect to fundamentals like roads and railway?
Great. I'm going to take a break there because that's a good response. We have 2 regional, and then we'll have time for one more round of questions, we hope. I'll just open it to you guys. Who would like to begin to start talking about regional harmonization, regional infrastructure issues, investments? Anybody? Nate, are you looking? Or was
Sure.
that a no? Or, oh, I thought that was a yes.
No,
If not, Beth, you go ahead.
I'm happy
Okay.
to. I may pass on the infrastructure question, and I'll let others respond to that. But the one observation I'd make in response to Katrin's question is that, it's interesting. I mean, commitments can be entered into multilaterally, regionally, but at the end of the day, I keep going back to I think Agnes's point that there is a capacity constraint, and the capacity, commitments are entered into regionally, but they're implemented locally, no matter what sort of commitment you're talking about. And so the capability that you have, it creates the capacity that you have creates a frontier to the extent to which you can actually have a multilateral or regional system that actually stands up in practice. So, there's a lot of great examples of clear support for a regional approach. If you look at the the seed harmonization across COMESA and SADC, that's taken a little bit of time, but now it's really seems to be kicking into gear. There's a lot of support, but you can't get past that key limiting factor.
Mm-hmm. Sure. How about all 3? But we'll do it really short. We'll just go this way. Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought about the regional integration, and I thought about the European Union and even the NAFTA agreement that we have with Mexico and Canada. Anytime you're in a regional body and you're all producing the same commodities, and there may be one player or 2 players that are real powerhouses in the region, it creates tension. And that's not a bad thing, but Africa is no different from the rest of the world. The European Union, when they expanded from 15 to 25, whatever it is, 26, they had the same problem with everybody producing the same thing. So so there are natural tensions within those bodies that you have to work out. We have to work those things out with our NAFTA partners, Canada and Mexico, and so I think that it's not unnatural that it's taking some time. And now you're talking about even people who have less capacity and a lot of getting together that they have to do. So I'm not surprised, but they're moving in the right direction.
Great. Agnes and then Beth, and the infrastructure question as well.
So some of the challenges that I see has to do with the whole idea of these individual countries and their own sovereignty, and trying to have country identification. What is important for me and what is driving integration has to be at the core of this. So until individual countries start understanding the big picture, which is the market size, and be able to move above that and understand the interconnectedness and the value of coming together as a 200 million people population than an 11 or 20 million people population. Until that happens, we will not have tangible movements around integration. And you get the sense that individual countries are still trying to find themselves, right? Recognizing that policy and capacities around policies are major issues. So when we do overcome that, when we do overcome our ability to make policies that are addressing the bigger issues in terms of the market that we draw ourselves, in terms of our ability to compete and finding the positions where we are comfortable, until we get there, it's always going to be, kind of a wishy-washy situation where you start and then stop, start and then stop. So again, for me, it goes very, very much to capacity issues. But in terms of the question you asked around what is happening at World Trade Organization, I also think that there's a real challenge there where you see that Africa has an opportunity to define what it's, not just define its position, because claiming and defining a position is one thing, but working towards making sure that that happens is another thing. So if you're not producing enough, and you're not having enough quality, and you're not having enough standards and measures to ensure that you're part of that market, however much you claim will not happen. So I feel like there's still a lot that is happening around failure to claim that stand appropriately and really worrying so much more about, yeah, this is my share, but what gets you to that share? I would love to be able to say, this is my share, because I can also put stuff on this market and competitively do so. But I think we get lost in fighting for those shares and forget that there are real policy decisions that have to be made around the kind of instruments we need to be able to be in that space. So I'm waiting for that day, because that war would be an interesting war if we have the capacities to be able to be part of it.
Good. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just quickly, just talking about trade and the importance of regional bodies. In West Africa, there was an agreement, a West Africa regional agreement, specifying no more than 3 checkpoints for transit cargo. That's wonderful. But now, of course, it has to go down to the country level again. And so really, in Togo, a group of private sector players got together and had an advocacy campaign and brought the Minister of Security and Civil Defense to go see sort of how hard it was to go up and down Togo with some cargo. And I think this was really eye-opening for him, and because of this trip, this issue was first raised with this regional agreement. Then some really active people got him out there, and he decided to make some changes, and they were able to reduce sort of the number of checkpoints and take the amount of time it took to go up and down Togo from 4 days down to 1 day. So I think that it's important to sort of elevate issues, but again, the decisions have to be made at the country level. So.
Agreed. In the interest of time, we're going to take one final question, which is never enough, right here. The guy in the yellow tie.
Hi, good morning. I'm Emilio Bunge from Development Finance International. Work with a number of agribusinesses, medium and large in a lot of these issues, and a proud member of CCA. So a shout out to Pat here. I guess my question is, I want to push this notion of agriculture as a business, because at the same time, we don't want to perpetuate poverty. And if we're always thinking of smallholder farmers, even if we increase their income 3 times, they're still making, instead of $2 a day, $6 a day. Sure. And so how are we thinking, there is a transition, but no developed economy has agriculture of more than 5 or 10% of their GDP. So how long-term are we thinking to solve those issues in terms of, non-farm jobs, and then resolving the tension of, food access that you were talking about? What are the price of food? As we increase, the incomes of the farmers and, the incomes in the food chain, how that translates into consumer prices? Are they willing to pay more? Thank you.
Pat?
Okay, so I look at this issue along the whole value chain. If you just talk about farming, then yes. But if you look at the processing sector, look at the United States. Look how big our agri-sector business is. We have General Mills, we have Kellogg's, we have all of these companies that are in that processing mode. If Africa moves toward that kind of agribusiness model, and they can, there's nothing that prevents them from doing it, then you're not talking about, you're talking about a very sophisticated and modernized system that is very inclusive of all the sectors of the value chain. And the farmer's income here certainly is not $2 or $3 a day. So it's an evolution.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much for our panel today. I just want to make a couple of closing remarks. One is, if you haven't looked yet, go to the CSIS website. We just launched a new website on Tuesday, and it is beautiful. And when you go to that website, look for the Global Food Security Project and make sure to sign up for our updates so you can know what else we have upcoming. One thing we didn't get to talk about today, which I would have loved to, but is around benchmarking indexes, because that's something that we're looking at right now. The World Bank released the Enabling Business of Agriculture back in January. It's sort of its second year. Last year was a pilot with 10 countries. This year it's 40 countries. There's been some other indexes in the past. I always say that word wrong, and anyway, thank you. We're really looking at that. How can different groups use that? We'll be doing a paper and doing an event around that in about a month. So if this topic interests you and that interests you, please continue to stay in touch with us. I also need to make an update around lunch. Now is lunch, a little early lunch, but no one ever minds that. If you want to watch the Ebola documentary, which is really great, I watched the whole thing, it's really fantastic, go pick up your sandwich on the concourse, which means that's down the stairs, and go to room C115 for if you want to watch the documentary. Otherwise, go grab your lunch and you can eat here on the second floor or any of the other concourse rooms downstairs. Thank you so much for coming and to our panel today.
Thank you, Agnes. Priscilla and I are coming to Kenya.